What does it mean to be triple-class refractory? How are triple-class refractory patients managed at relapse?
Yeah, so I think the term triple class refractory comes from the use of three major classes of drugs we have for the treatment of myeloma. So the first one is proteasome inhibitors, and we have three that are FDA approved. One is bortezomib, which is the first one. Then there's carfilzomib, and then there's ixazomib. These are the three proteasome inhibitors we have. Then there's a second group of drugs called immunomodulatory drugs, and again, here we have three choices as well: thalidomide, lenalidomide, pomalidomide. These are all oral drugs belonging to the class of immunomodulatory drugs. And then about 8-9 years back, we had the third major class of drug for myeloma, which are the CD38 antibodies. And again, here we have two choices: daratumumab and isatuximab. So those are the three major classes of drugs that are available for our patients. So when you say triple class refractory, it means patients who have received at least one drug from each of these classes, and their disease has progressed while on these drugs or has relapsed fairly quickly after treatments on these treatments. So triple class refractory patients are patients who have received one or more of these three classes of drugs, and their disease is now refractory to one or more of the drugs in each of the classes. And the reason we talk about triple class refractory so much is these three classes of drugs are very much integrated into treatments of newly diagnosed myeloma, early relapses. So when you're talking about patients with 2, 3, 4 lines of treatment, that's largely patients with triple class refractory where we need novel choices, novel options. And that's where things like CAR T cells, bispecific antibodies come into play.
Triple class refractory refers to refractory to the three most common therapies that we use in initial therapy. Proteasome inhibitors, drugs like Velcade, Kyprolis, and Ninlaro. Immunomodulatory drugs like Revlimid, thalidomide, and pomalidomide, and anti-CD38 antibodies, drugs like Darzalex or daratumumab, and our Sarclisa isatuximab. And so the three classes of drugs that the patient's refractory to, meaning the myeloma is worse despite being on these drugs, again, are proteasome inhibitors, IMiDs, and the monoclonal antibodies, particularly the anti-CD38 monoclonal antibodies. And so the question is what do we do for patients with triple class refractory? But even before that, why is triple class refractory important? We know it's important because patients who have triple class refractory historically have had short remissions from subsequent therapy, as well as a shortened overall survival. And so it's really important that we come up with new therapies for these patients.
It depends on where. Sometimes now with the advent of daratumumab as more and more being used in the frontline setting as part of quadruplets, we can see patients being triple refractory after 1 or 2 lines. And that leaves a really big challenge given that the approvals of these drugs and treatments that we want, like teclistamab, CAR T cells, are for 4+ lines of treatment. So one of the big challenges we have now is what do we do for patients who are triple class refractory but have only had 1 or 2 lines of treatments? And I think that will change, as I mentioned, as new data comes along. Some of these treatments will move earlier. But currently, I guess the choices would be to use a combination that the patient has not received previously would be one option. A second option would be to use a drug like selinexor, which is an oral drug, which has activity in triple-class refractory myeloma. It has a mechanism that's distinct from these other 3 classes. So that would be another choice. Or really clinical trials. There are many clinical trials that are being evaluating CAR T cells, bispecific antibodies, other novel therapies in this space that I think for eligible patients would make a lot of sense. If this is a triple class refractory after, say, 4 lines of treatment, then that's the patient that we should consider for CAR T cells or bispecific antibody. And we have one of those bispecific antibodies, teclistamab, that's approved by the FDA. Now, the common part of all these 3 drugs are that they target a protein called BCMA. So both the CAR T cells and teclistamab target a protein called BCMA that's present on the surface of myeloma cells. Again, a mechanism that's quite distinct from the 3 classes of drugs we talked about a little while back.
Since the recording of this video, 2 additional bispecific antibodies have been FDA approved for triple-class refractory patients who have received 4 prior lines of therapy. Many more bispecific antibodies are in development.
So the question is, how do you manage triple class refractory patients? So that means they've seen a monoclonal antibody, they've seen an immunomodulatory drug, they've seen a proteasome inhibitor like Velcade or carfilzomib, daratumumab or isatuximab, and they are seeing Revlimid, and they are refractory. That means they have not responded to it or they progress on it. So how do we manage them? Yeah. So that's a very good, important question. I think the first way is to put them on a clinical trial, because that's how you're going to make a difference, is learn what is the best treatment for a patient who really have failed these three drugs, a class of drugs. So clinical trials is my favorite answer, but obviously now the FDA approved other drugs that are available on the market, the CAR T cells, and also the bispecific T cell engager. So they are available. Obviously, we're learning how to administer those to the patients. And we have now clinical trials to say after, 1 to 3 line of therapy, you can use, CAR T cells. So clinical trials, bispecific T cell engager, novel therapy, new things that you have not used up front.
So what do we do with patients who have triple class refractory? We have treatment options available. We have Expovio or selinexor, which is an oral agent, also being looked at earlier lines. That's available. That can, in certain situations, overcome resistance to prior refractoriness to things like pomalidomide or Kyprolis. And then the other therapies that we have in the triple class refractory setting are the new BCMA targeted therapies, CAR T cells and bispecific antibodies.
How do you manage triple class refractory patients who have had subsequent relapses?
Yeah, so that becomes more and more challenging, and I think this is really where we should be considering clinical trials. So again, we've been doing BCMA-directed CAR T cells and bispecific antibodies now for 7 or 8 years. So I have some patients who got their first CAR T cell more than 6, 7 years back, and unfortunately, some of them eventually relapsed. And it is another area of significant unmet need, to my mind. What do you do after you get a CAR T cell? And unfortunately, it stops working after a little while. The good news, I guess, is in clinical trials, we have several other treatments that look promising, drugs that target, for instance, GPRC5D, another protein that's present on myeloma cells, treatments that target FcRH5, a third antigen or protein that's present on myeloma cells.
Since the recording of this video, talquetamab, a bispecific antibody targeting GPRC5D, received accelerated approval from the FDA.
Unfortunately, for now, they're available in the context of clinical trials. And so this is really where I would encourage patients and their doctors to be proactive about looking for clinical trials within their center or outside. For instance, we now have patients here who have gotten more than one CAR T cell. So they've gotten a BCMA CAR T cell that worked well for a while. And then unfortunately, when it stopped working, they were able to go on another clinical trial targeting a different protein and still benefit from that treatment. So there are several options, but some of which might require more investigation into trial options, availability, etc.
Clinical trials is really critical in the triple class refractory patient population, especially in that space where the patient can't get approved for these 4th and 5th line therapies. Using a clinical trial would be really important for 2 reasons. One is that the reason we place a patient or recommend a clinical trial is because we think that's the best option for the patient. And even phase 1 studies whose design is to try to figure out the right dose and schedule of the drug, the reason we're recommending a phase 1 study is that we are all hopeful that that drug will help the patient with myeloma.
In the triple class refractory population, would using a different agent in the same class of drugs work, or is it best to look for treatments that have new mechanisms of action?
So typically we would like to use, in triple class refractory patients, even if you try a drug from a different class, the likelihood of long-lasting success is relatively lower. We can utilize those drugs, but they have to be combined with, a new mechanism of action. So that's kind of like the general concept. But it also has to do with how much time you have. Is this disease moving rapidly? Do you need to see a response yesterday, or can you try some easier treatments before patients actually become symptomatic? So it also has to do with how quickly you want that response and which treatment option will give you that likelihood.
Are CELMoDs used in triple class refractory?
I think it's too early to say, and it's also too early to say which CELMoD will be positioned and for what kind of patients. but it looks like the CELMoDs are active in patients who are len and pomalidomide refractory. So, they're certainly more active, and if they do come along, especially in combination with other mechanisms of actions, then yes, we'd use them too.
Do all triple-class refractory patients have the same outcomes?
So the meaning of triple class refractory or exposed and resistant, triple class exposed and resistant to one, is variable, I think, and it means different things to different people. But importantly, a number of studies, such as the Mammoth study, looked at that group of patients and found that the prognosis was not good. And so it's a group of patients where novel treatments have been tried. It's been an important group because it's allowed us to move forward rapidly with new therapies. The issue with the group is it's diverse. And so not all patients that are triple class refractory have a poor outcome. There's a lot of variability between individuals, and the genetic makeup of the group is not homogeneous. So comparing between groups done in different studies is ill-advised and probably shouldn't be done. So you might get some idea about the efficacy of a drug, but to say one drug is better than another drug based on its activity in relapse refractory cases is fraught with dangers. However, like I say, we've been very successful evaluating the CAR-Ts and the bispecific therapies in this group of patients because we've seen remarkable response rates with 90% plus of people responding and durable responses where we saw improvements of just 2 to 3 months. We've now seen people treated with CAR-Ts and bispecifics that are alive and well out to 30 months and beyond, which is why there's so much excitement about the efficacy of these drugs and how they're going to behave in an earlier line of therapy.
To learn more about the drugs mentioned in this video, visit the link in the description.